A federal gunfight just turned upside down, and millions of Americans have no idea what changed. If you still think the ATF can enforce every Biden-era gun rule the same way it did before, you could be making a serious mistake right now. Quick question before we continue. Are you subscribed? Because what I'm about to reveal could keep you from trusting bad advice, old rumors, or flat-out false legal takes. Hit that button now, because gun law changes fast, and the people who react late are usually the ones who get hurt first. Here is what just happened. A lot of channels are screaming that one federal judge wiped out 7 major ATF rules. That title grabs attention, but the real story is a little different, and honestly, even more important. This was not one magic order that erased every federal gun rule overnight. What really happened was a chain of major ATF losses, court defeats, dropped appeals, settlements, and policy reversals that together gave gun owners real relief in several huge areas. Let me break that down for you in plain English. First, the bump stock rule got crushed at the Supreme Court in Garland versus Cargill. The court said the ATF went beyond what Congress actually wrote. In simple terms, the agency tried to treat bump stocks like machine guns, and the court said, no, that is not what the law says. That matters because it sends a message. The ATF cannot just stretch words until normal people become felons. Second, the pistol brace rule took a massive hit. A federal court wiped that rule out, which means the rule was taken off the books, not just paused for one tiny group. Then the government dropped its appeal. That is a big deal. Why? Because millions of gun owners spent years wondering if a piece of plastic on the back of a firearm could suddenly turn them into criminals. That fear did not come from Congress passing a new law. It came from agency reinterpretation, and courts pushed back. Third, the ATF's forced reset trigger theory also got hammered. A Texas federal judge said the agency could not just call these triggers machine guns by rewriting the meaning of the statute. Then, the Justice Department settled the fight instead of pushing the same theory deeper into court. That is another sign the government knew the ground under that argument was getting shaky. But here's the crazy part. Those are only the biggest headlines. On top of that, the DOJ and ATF repealed the so-called zero-tolerance policy for gun dealers. They also announced they were reviewing the stabilizing brace rule and the rule on who counts as being engaged in the business of selling firearms. So when people say 7 major ATF rules or actions just got wiped out, rolled back, or neutralized, they are bundling all of those together. Now, does that mean every federal gun restriction is dead? No. And here is what most people get wrong. Relief is real, but it is not a free-for-all. Some of these wins are total, some are partial, some are still being sorted out. And one major ATF rule, the ghost gun rule, actually survived at the Supreme Court. So if somebody tells you, relax, everything is legal now, do not believe that for 1 second. Let me show you why this matters to you in real life. Imagine you bought a braced firearm 2 years ago. Then the ATF rule dropped, and suddenly you were told that you might need to register it, change it, remove parts, or risk felony trouble. A lot of gun owners felt trapped. They were not trying to break the law. They were trying to keep up with a law that seemed to change by press release. When a federal court wipes out a rule like that, it is not just a legal footnote. It changes how regular people sleep at night. And the same thing applies to small sellers. Imagine you sell a few firearms from your collection over time. Most people think, I'm just a hobbyist. I'm not a gun store. But when the ATF expands the idea of who's engaged in the business, the line gets blurry fast. That is where ordinary people get nervous. Not because they are criminals, but because they cannot tell where the agency thinks the line is anymore. This is the part that shocked me. The biggest relief here is not just about one accessory or one device. It is about courts telling agencies, you do not get to invent crimes by changing definitions after the fact. That principle matters whether you own 1 firearm or 20. It matters whether you carry daily or only go to the range twice a year. Because once an agency can change the meaning of one term, it can try to change the meaning of another. If you are finding this helpful, imagine what you will learn in my next video about the 5 words that protect you when cops ask about your gun. Subscribe so you do not miss it, because the legal side of gun ownership is getting just as important as the gear side. Now let us go deeper, because this is where it gets interesting. First, the bump stock case. Most people heard the headline and stopped there. But the real lesson from Cargill was bigger than bump stocks. The Supreme Court basically said that if Congress wants to ban something, Congress has to do the job. The ATF cannot take a word like machine gun, stretch it past its normal meaning, and then threaten prison if you disagree. That kind of ruling does not just affect one product. It becomes a weapon against future agency overreach. Think about that for a second. If you are at a traffic stop, and the government claims your setup falls into some new category that did not exist the way normal people understood it last year, what protects you? Clear law protects you, not vibes. Not politics, not press conferences, clear law. That is why these cases matter even to people who never touched a bump stock in their life. Second, the pistol brace fight may be the most personal one for average owners. Why? because it reached into homes all over America. A lot of people bought braced firearms legally from stores in good faith. Then the rule changed, and suddenly they were told that the same item could be treated like a short-barreled rifle under federal law. That is the kind of change that makes normal people lose trust in the system. Here is a hypothetical example to explain this. Let us say you bought a firearm with a brace for home defense because it was easier to control. You filled out the paperwork. You passed the background check. You followed the rules. Then, months later, the government says, actually, now we see this differently. That is not just confusing. That can be life-changing. Because federal gun law penalties are not small. We are talking about charges that can destroy your finances, your rights, and your future. And here's the part nobody is talking about. After the brace rule was wiped out, the ATF later even put out information for people who had pending applications tied to that old rule, saying they could withdraw them. Read that again in plain English. The agency itself had to deal with the fact that the rule had been vacated nationwide. That tells you how serious this loss was. Third, forced reset triggers. This one matters because the government tried a familiar move. It looked at a fast-firing device and said, close enough, call it a machine gun. But the judge in Texas did not buy that. He relied on the same basic logic the Supreme Court used in the bump stock case. The law says what it says. If the trigger still works in a way that does not fit the statute, the agency cannot fix that by wishful thinking. Now, quick legal note. This is educational information, not legal advice. Always consult an attorney for your specific situation. That sentence matters because these cases are powerful, but your facts still matter. Your state law matters, your exact setup matters, your local prosecutor matters, and your timing matters. A win in federal court does not erase every state restriction. So do not make the mistake of hearing ATF lost and assuming you can ignore every gun law in your zip code. But wait, there is something even more important. These wins show a pattern. Courts are getting less willing to give agencies unlimited room to rewrite criminal law. That should matter to every American, even people who do not own guns. Because if a federal agency can turn you into a criminal by changing definitions instead of changing statutes, nobody's really safe from moving goalposts. Hey, 73% of people watching right now aren't subscribed. Don't be part of that group. Join the gun owners who get these updates first, because by the time mainstream news explains this stuff, the damage is usually already done. Click subscribe right now. Now let us talk about the next 4 pieces of this so-called 7-rule collapse, because this is where the relief becomes more practical. Number 4 is the zero tolerance policy. That policy hit gun dealers hard. Under that approach, dealers could lose their federal licenses for violations the government said were willful. Supporters said it improved compliance. Critics said it became a hammer that punished paperwork mistakes like they were proof of bad intent. In 2025, DOJ and ATF repealed that policy. For dealers, that is immediate relief. For buyers, it matters too, because fewer lawful dealers getting crushed means fewer places for regular people to buy firearms legally. Number 5 is the government's retreat on stabilizing braces as a broader policy matter. Even after the court loss, DOJ and ATF announced they were reviewing that whole framework. That tells you something important. When the government starts reviewing a rule after getting smacked in court, it usually means the old path became very hard to defend. That does not mean the issue is gone forever, but it does mean the old playbook is broken. Number 6 is the rule on who counts as being engaged in the business of selling firearms. This is one of those dry-sounding rules that can hit ordinary people in a big way. Most people think a dealer is obvious, a storefront, inventory, a business sign. But when the definition gets stretched, private collectors and hobbyists start wondering if selling part of a collection could trigger federal problems. That uncertainty chills normal behavior. It makes people scared to do lawful things because they do not trust where the line is. The DOJ and ATF announcing a review of that rule is not the same as a total nationwide court win, but it is still real relief because it shows the rule is under serious pressure. Number 7 is the forced reset trigger settlement itself. Some people skip over settlements because they want dramatic judge language, but settlements matter. They tell you whether the government wants to keep fighting or get out. In this case, the Justice Department chose to settle litigation tied to rare breed and related cases after courts started rejecting the ATF's theory. That is not a tiny side note. That is the federal government backing away from a legal position that had become dangerous for it to defend. Now, this is where you need to stay sharp. Relief does not mean victory on everything. The ghost gun rule is the best example. In Bonney versus Vanderstock, the Supreme Court upheld that rule. So if you think every unfinished frame, parts kit, or build situation is now totally outside federal reach, that is flat wrong. This is the mistake I keep warning people about. They hear 3 wins, then assume all 7 or 8 related issues move the same way. They did not. Most people think gun law is one giant yes or no switch, legal or illegal, good or bad. But the truth is messier. One rule gets wiped out, another gets reviewed, another gets narrowed, another survives. That is why you cannot live on headlines alone. Let me make this personal. Imagine your buddy sends you a screenshot and says, "Bro, ATF is done. Everything changed." If you act on that message without checking the details, here is what could happen. You could keep an item that is still restricted under state law. You could transfer something in a way your state does not allow. You could rely on an old rumor about braces, triggers, or homemade builds and walk yourself into a serious mess. That is why information matters more than emotion. And here's the bigger takeaway. The ATF got checked because courts finally asked a basic question. Did Congress clearly authorize this? If the answer is no, the agency has a problem. That is good news for people who believe criminal law should be written by lawmakers, not invented by regulators. But it also means the battle shifts. If Congress wants these restrictions, some lawmakers may try to pass them directly. So the next front may not be the agency. It may be Capitol Hill. This information could literally change again before the next election cycle fully settles out. Subscribe now, because the next video explains exactly what rules changed, what rules survived, and what mistakes gun owners need to avoid while all this keeps moving. So here's the bottom line. The ATF did take a series of major losses. The bump stock rule fell. The pistol brace rule was wiped out. The forced reset trigger theory got rejected and then settled. The zero tolerance policy was repealed. And other major firearms rules are under serious review. That is real relief. But it is not a blank check. And it does not mean every federal or state restriction disappeared. If this helped you cut through the noise, subscribe right now and stay with this channel, because bad gun law information spreads faster than good gun law information, and the price of getting it wrong can be brutal. One last simple disclaimer. This video is for education only. It is not legal advice, and before you make any decision about your firearm, your carry, your transfer, or your setup, talk to a qualified attorney in your state.